My long-absent mother persuaded me to come mend our fractured bond just before my wedding, only to unveil that she was entangled with the very tormentor of my high school days. Chaos erupted. I, a 24-year-old woman on the brink of matrimony in 3 months, was to wed my fiancé Andy, a 25-year-old man with whom I had shared a college romance, and when he proposed mere months ago, I embraced it without hesitation. My father was the initial confidant, being the sole parent I still maintained contact with, since my mother and I had been estranged for nearly 3 years, ever since she arrived inebriated at my inaugural Thanksgiving dinner in my apartment, unleashing a barrage of insults at both me and my carefully prepared meal. It may seem trivial, but that moment was the final straw that shattered what little remained of our bond. My mother had perpetually craved the spotlight, forever striving to eclipse my achievements as if we were locked in an endless contest, and on that fateful Thanksgiving I finally confronted her about this relentless rivalry. Utterly wasted and theatrically unruly, she dismissed my plea to cease, launching into a torrent of expletives that scorched me, my cooking, my looks, and even hurled disparaging remarks about Andy. At that juncture, my dad had no choice but to haul her off and exit, as her unruly behavior was demolishing the evening. Not long after, my parents divorced, initiated by my mother in a shocking twist, as she had apparently grown weary of sharing her life with my father, departing with little explanation as to her sudden desire for separation. It has now been 3 years since that disastrous Thanksgiving and the subsequent divorce, during which my mother and I had not exchanged a word, and honestly, I felt a sense of relief. My dad, however, was shattered by her departure, having loved her deeply and endured her relentless misbehavior over the years, only for everything to unravel. One fine day, all because she inexplicably lost her love for him, though it took time, he has slowly found solace. I never mourned her absence, for she had always been a detestable, narcissistic, and self-absorbed person. I only lament not having remembered these truths when, a few days ago, she unexpectedly contacted me, having learned from distant relatives of my impending wedding, pleading for a visit to make things right before I embarked on a new chapter. As cliched as it sounded, there was something oddly heartfelt in her plea. Yet skepticism gripped me, for she remained the same woman who had belittled me throughout my childhood, instilling a relentless sense of inadequacy. So I confided in Andy, who urged me to take a chance. After all, 3 years had passed, and perhaps she had transformed. Though that hope was misplaced, I nonetheless resolved to meet her. This decision quickly proved disastrous, for once I consented to the meeting, she demanded I come to her home for lunch. I had intended a neutral restaurant rendezvous, believing it more proper for our first encounter, yet she persuaded me otherwise, and I reluctantly acquiesced. 2 days prior, I journeyed to the address she provided, and, curiously, the place exuded a haunting familiarity. I strained to remember its connection to my past, but to no avail, so I simply approached the door and rang the bell, dismissing my nagging doubts as mere nerves from a long hiatus. But as the door swung open, the dreadful truth unfurled. Standing there was none other than my high school math teacher, the man who loathed me and had tormented me relentlessly, an image so shocking I nearly did a double take, instinctively turning to retreat to my car. For a fleeting moment, I assumed it was merely one of her cruel pranks. After all, sending me face to face with my high school nightmare seemed par for her course, so I mumbled that it must be an error, apologized, and began to turn away, only to be halted in my tracks by his command to return. Inside, I heard my mother calling his name, and to my astonishment, he addressed her endearingly as honey, beckoning her to join him at the door. By then, the horrifying puzzle began to form, yet my mind struggled to grasp the full weight of it. As my mother emerged into view, I stood frozen, like a deer in headlights. She greeted me with a disarming smile, as though it were entirely ordinary to be at her ex-lover's residence. In a hushed voice, I inquired how long this farce had persisted, and she nonchalantly revealed that it had been underway for nearly 4 years, devoid of any hint of shame. My heart plummeted as her words sank in, realizing the grim reason behind my parents' split, and in a burst of anguish, I screamed at her, demanding to know how she could betray both me and my father. In that moment, I was torn between fury over her dalliance with my high school tormentor and her betrayal of my dad. I hurled expletives as she attempted to placate me, but overwhelmed, I fled without a backward glance, even as she cried my name, unwittingly setting the stage for more pain. I sped back home in a daze, miraculously avoiding any mishaps on the road, for my mind was utterly elsewhere. The moment I stepped through my door, I collapsed into despair, so shattered that Andy had to abandon all his plans to comfort me. I had kept my meeting with Mom a secret from my father, believing, in a misguided attempt to shield him from further pain, that voicing it would solidify the horror. Though I eventually confided in Andy, who argued that I should alert my dad before any rumors spread, I wasn't prepared to confront the fallout, even if I bore no true culpability. After I departed, my mother reached out with messages, yet I have left them unopened, convinced that no words from her could possibly mend the rift or ease the agony. I'm not exaggerating, my math teacher despised me with a fervor, epitomizing the ultimate bully who spared no chance to belittle me, and his venom had scarred my self-worth deeply. As for my mother, our already fraught history, compounded by her shocking betrayal, leaves me doubting I can ever trust her again. Seeing them side by side at the doorway, it was as if the twin terrors of my youth had conspired to form an even more monstrous nightmare, a vision too surreal to comprehend. The crushing despair of that day convinced me that seeking reconciliation with my mother had been a colossal error. I attempted to banish the memory and act as if it never occurred, only to be jolted by a call from my father this morning. We hadn't truly spoken since that meeting, for I feared I might inadvertently reveal the painful truth, and I sensed that, deep down, he still harbored lingering love for her. When he rang today, I endeavored to sound nonchalant, but he was already aware of my mother's new lover, having called specifically to confront me. Initially, he queried whether I had seen her in the last week, to which I promptly lied by saying no. Even as he pressed for certainty, I continued to deny, though the truth loomed between us. Ultimately, he admonished me to stop dodging the issue, revealing that my mother had phoned him the previous day and spilled every detail. She had pleaded for his help in persuading me to reconcile with her before the wedding, claiming she wished to be present for me. He disclosed that my mother had recounted her liaison with my former teacher and implored him to coax me into forgiving her and agreeing to another visit. I attempted to offer my perspective, but he interrupted, stating that while he no longer cared for my mother, he was profoundly let down by my failure to confide in him immediately, as he had always counted on me above all else. I stammered an apology, only to be told that he required time to reflect, believing that a temporary silence between us was for the best. Hurt by his rebuff, I tried to engage him further, but he abruptly ended the call before I could utter another word. Hours have passed since, and I have exhausted every means to reach him, calling, texting, even driving by his house, only to be met with silence. I remain clueless about his whereabouts, as he has not replied to any attempt. I even approached his secretary, who claimed he was indisposed for the day and unreachable. Sensing deceit, I pressed her for alternate contact details, but she insisted that strict orders from my father prevented anyone, including me, from speaking with him today. Subsequently, I reluctantly abandoned my efforts, recognizing that he did not wish to speak to me at present. Returning from work a few hours ago, a heavy cloud of depression enveloped me, and even though I confided in Andy, he maintained that my father's anger was justified. I had an opportunity to reveal everything to him in the days following the incident, yet I withheld the truth in an effort to shield him, forgetting that he was a grown man capable of handling reality, though, in hindsight, honesty should have prevailed. Andy may have been right, but I also yearned for my dad to grasp my perspective, knowing all too well the depths of his heartbreak when my mother departed. I never wanted him to relapse into that abyss. I understand his fury, yet I believe he ought to afford me some mercy. I wrestled with the crushing revelation, unable to accept that my mother was, in every excruciating detail, the vilest person I had ever known, and I was tormented by guilt over not immediately telling my father about her betrayal. Update 1. I realize many of you felt an apology to my father wasn't necessary, yet I offered one anyway, driven by the deep love I hold for him, the only parent who ever truly nurtured me, and whose unwavering support I cannot afford to lose. I doubt I'd be where I am today if not for his steady care. It was outrageous that he tolerated my mother's incessant need to outshine me, yet he always ensured my well-being and strived to preserve a fragile peace between us, a rare beacon of calm amid our chaotic family storm. I needn't justify my actions, but since I'm bearing these truths here, I felt compelled to explain my choices, hoping you won't unleash too much judgment upon me. Returning to my father's story, I reached out after nearly 4 silent days, and finally, he answered. The initial awkwardness soon gave way to my determination to get it over with, so I blurted out my apology for not revealing the moment I discovered Mom's infidelity and the identity of her partner. I then poured out my side of the story, confessing that I was trying to shield him from further devastation, knowing all too well the depths of his despair when Mom abandoned him, and I couldn't bear to be the harbinger of news that might plunge him into chaos once again. Struggling to articulate my reasoning, I insisted I was solely trying to protect him, not colluding with Mom or hiding the truth for her sake, as he might have suspected. After another heartfelt apology and a pause heavy with unsaid words, my father, his voice trembling with sorrow, admitted that his recent outburst wasn't meant for me at all. He'd misplaced his anger, and he was truly sorry. He confessed that I was right. The shock of learning that his wife of over 2 decades hadn't simply lost interest, but had been unfaithful all along, her secret betrayal being the true reason she left, was almost too much to bear. He revealed that after nearly 3 years of her absence he'd begun to accept that she no longer wanted him, but when he discovered she'd been with another man, he utterly lost control. Then he shared the words he had hurled at my mother when she called him, demanding he coax me into reconciliation, a detail I left out before because it was too long, yet I must emphasize her audacity in running to her ex, confessing her betrayal, and asking for a favor all in one breath. It still boggles my mind that she ever assumed my father would force me to reconcile with her after she started dating the very man who terrorized me in high school, a man so despicable, and she so callous, though I digress. During that call, once her monologue ended, my father snapped, telling her to go to hell, declaring that a cheater and liar like her had no right to share in my joy. In that moment, I realized fleeing her house had been the right choice. If she truly believed my father would help her, she should have sought a psychologist instead, for her delusions were painfully clear. I must add, my father rarely loses his temper, but when he does, it's a spectacle. Andy and I even chuckled at his biting retort to her, and at how flabbergasted she sounded, babbling in futile defense, before he hung up without another word. He refused to let her gaslight him, and even though his pain over her infidelity still runs deep, I couldn't be prouder of him for standing his ground and refusing to be bullied like he once was. For now, my dad and I are on steady ground. We exchanged apologies and agreed to let bygones be bygones, burying the hatchet. Many have insisted I owe no apology and that my father is being overly entitled. I partly agree, but he is my father, and maintaining a loving relationship with him is vital as I approach what should be the happiest day of my life. Andy agrees I did the right thing by reaching out first, so that's that. Update 2. I'm back to discuss my mother, and in truth, I deeply regret setting foot in her house the other day, or even worse, agreeing to meet her and make things right before the wedding, because dealing with her is nothing short of psychotic. Perhaps 3 years of estrangement had dulled my memory of her lunacy, but now it all crashes back, and I vividly recall why I cut her off in the first place. I blocked her a couple of days ago after discovering she had convinced my dad to talk to me, hoping to mend our fractured bond. I did that because I recognized her as the same toxic old snake who would never change, and on top of that, she was dating the man I despised most in my teenage years, and still do. There was no reason for me to forgive her and reopen old wounds. My life was fine without her meddling until she somehow tracked me down and decided to pay me a visit with her nightmare boyfriend. 2 days ago, while I was at home and Andy was outside in the garden on a client call, I was preoccupied with work. When the doorbell rang, I absent-mindedly opened the door, only to find my mother and her boyfriend standing there. Before I could process the shock, they barged into my living room and flopped on my couch as if I had invited them. Snapping back to reality, I demanded an explanation for their intrusion and ordered them to leave immediately. I had no desire for them in my home. My mother claimed they were there to talk things through like mature adults, insisting that as family we needed to stick together. I shot back that I no longer considered her family, especially after what she did to my dad and me, and told her to leave now or I'd call the police. Feigning innocence, she asked what exactly she had done to warrant such hatred from us, which only fueled my exasperation. I wasn't going to let her off the hook. I told her squarely that, first, she had betrayed my father, the man who gave her a wonderful life, and that she cheated on him with a mediocre high school teacher, a man who found cruel amusement in bullying kids simply for being bad at math, a petty, spiteful reason that ruined my self-esteem. At least her boyfriend had the decency to stop glaring at me and lower his eyes in shame when I said that. Then, shifting tactics, my mother tried to downplay her actions, claiming it wasn't a big deal because she could have had a great life even without my father, and that he wasn't the paragon I had always praised. That was laughable, considering my dad is a brilliant surgeon and my mother never even set foot in college, a transparent bluff, which I immediately called out. She then attempted to defend her boyfriend, insisting he wasn't all that bad, even though everyone from my school would agree he was a nasty bully who should never have been allowed to teach. Blinded by her infatuation, she continued, arguing that if I had only listened to his criticisms and worked harder, I might have improved, thus, it wasn't his fault at all. That was the breaking point. I lost it and began screaming hysterically at her, an outburst I still cringe at, though it did catch Andy's attention as he rushed back from his phone call. Andy grabbed me to calm me down, pulling me away as he yelled at my mother and her boyfriend to leave immediately or face the cops. They must have thought I'd lost my mind because they left in a hurry. I ranted for nearly an hour after they left, and it took a long time for my fury to subside. When calm finally came, I collapsed into sleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke, my dad had come over, and he, along with Andy, cared for me, ensuring I was emotionally okay, which was a truly sweet gesture. It's been 2 days without a word from my mother, and I fervently hope the silence holds. Update 3. It's been 4 weeks since my last update, and my mother still hasn't contacted me, which gives me hope that my meltdown finally convinced her to stay far away. I've heard she's been whispering to everyone, trying to paint me as a horrible person for cutting her off merely because she adores her current beau, but let's be real, no one's buying that tale anymore. Nearly all of our mutual friends and her relatives know about her cheating on my dad, and they're not impressed by her victim act. Meanwhile, my dad and I are happier than ever, and that's how it's going to remain.